Hey, this is Philip Steiger at thebest3d.com, and today I want to talk to you a little bit more about fire in the sky, fire, flames, animated fire, smoke, perhaps creating a fire that could be at the tip of a candle or inside a fireplace, sort of as an asset, an animated texture, maybe a looping animated texture that you could see using inside of a 3D program or of a game. So the place we want to do to start is with particle brushes. I'm going to go with the particle brushes here and make sure I'm on the particles and then enable that. And by default, you'll get something like this. So we'll work from that to turn it a little bit more like hot gas or fire going upwards, and also giving us a little bit more of the reddish color that we might expect, yellowish, reddish, something like that. So one thing we'll want to do is have it shoot upwards rather than downwards, and so with that we can simply turn the gravity around. That would probably do it. We could give it a negative gravity, like -1. And then as we paint, it's shooting upwards. There is another way to do something like that too. Let me go back to the default. I think was 0.9, but 1 is just fine. And that's if you use the drag value and drag it in the opposite direction. So let's say you give it a -1, it's shooting downwards, even it's shooting in the same direction. But if you give it like a 2 or something like that, it's shooting in the opposite direction of what your gravity and movement might indicate. And then you can of course do a little bit more dependency on some other things, like having some randomness there. Particles follow the mouse, use mouse velocity, randomize, a couple of things to do to make it look a bit more erratic. And that's actually good for grass. I mean, if you change the color here and you want to do certain types of grass, or a broomstick, I don't know. There's a lot of different uses for that. Maybe that's too much randomized, so let's go back to 0 and just keep it like that. But now the thing we want to do is actually make it a little bit more like particles of smoke, or something a little bit thicker, maybe fewer of it too. So we can go with maximum particles, maybe just 200, 2-3 is still too much, 1, 2, 3, something like that. And then instead of using the line mode, see if we can go to a shrinking line. Let me go erase this for now. That looks a little bit thinner. You can certainly work with the sizes here as well, and some other parameters. One thing that I find really useful too is the shrinking lines, switching over to the brush, so using basically the current brush. And so now that depends on what is your current brush, right? If you look at the airbrush, medium airbrush perhaps, and then go back, enable this, you'll see something like this that might be useful for something a little bit bigger in terms of flames or bits and pieces of air going up there. So one thing I'd like to do is perhaps also give it a little bit of an erratic behavior to it. And at that point, we basically need a force field, right? And with the force field, we'll basically deflect it and give it a bit more of an erratic behavior, turbulent behavior. And so one thing we can do, perhaps before that, choose a color like this one here for the gradient. And we can always refine that a little bit later. We can click on the gradient and say, maybe let's not go all the way white. In fact, let's reverse it. Let's go kind of start from something that's not fully white, something like this, maybe a little bit more red all along, and then a little bit blue, even kind of a purplish tint, and go into the reddish there. So we have kind of a color like this. The transparency we can mess with too, but not all of the functions will use that. That is particularly useful for drawing with particles, but we might see that perhaps in some particular case that may not exactly have the effect we hope to see. But anyway, we have the starting point here of some flames that we just need to give a little bit more of erratic behavior to it, maybe even fewer. Let's see, just 33 here on the number, just as a starting point. So now how do we add sort of a force field that deflects it? One thing we can do is we can go to filter and render some sort of a plasma noise, or one I like is the cold lava. The cold lava will just, let's take just a default one here. And so we use this field, this image, as a force field. And the way you do that in the particle settings is simply down here on the left, there's a force field. And so that will toggle a force field created from this image. And it takes a couple of seconds to analyze it. And so now if you give it a bit more power, you'll see that these particles are starting to behave in a rather erratic way and kind of be contained in that. Now the trick is therefore to also have not too much of that, so it still goes upwards, and then also perhaps increase the gravity field a little bit, perhaps give it a 0 so it's really going in all directions the same way, or give it a -1 like we saw earlier, regardless of the drag parameter. Now here we have really a lot of force, so that's probably maybe we need to do a +1 or 2 or so. Okay, so some combination there of this will possibly help you create something like these air particles or hot pockets of air going up as you paint around here. Now the thing is it comes in bursts, and then it takes a while for more of that to happen, so we may want to also have it a little bit more consistent, continuous, right? So change the size perhaps so it goes a little bit faster, and then increase the count here. I don't know how many we need for it to eventually appear like it's going continuously. Something like this might be just good enough. So let's keep the force field here. Let's erase the image altogether. The force field is still in effect here though, right? So as you paint this, it's going to keep doing that. Let's go and erase to black. And in fact, let's go and create an animation from that. Let's say an animation of 123. I got a lazy hand here. I'm going to go just whoop 1, 2, 3, just for quick dabble. And what I'm going to do is simply say, okay, somewhere around here we have this fire going around like that. All right, one brush stroke. Just do a couple of those. Let's do that again. So woo, keep drawing, boom. And then let's go. Now you can undo that, and you can redo it. Now you can right click on this, and I will just redo, but it will show the current image. You can also just hit A, and it will show it again. But if you do Shift A, it will actually re-execute the most recent command. It may look slightly different because there's some randomness to that, but it will re-execute that command with all the positional changes. So it has a record of the movement you did, the path that your mouse went through. That record can be played also in another tool, and that's the animation stroke player, right? That brush stroke can be replayed. So by default, it's on the current frame that it will paint it, and you can replay it there, and it will just keep rendering that on top and paint that again, right? So another thing you can do is paint it. Let's erase this, and then paint it on all frames, or even just a range, a subset of the frames. But if you go to all frames here, you can repaint it, and you can see, oh, I had one, I guess, at the very end or somewhere it was still there. But you can see now, oh, that's not good. I'll probably, okay, let me redo that. Let me create a new animation with black as the background, and I'm gonna go with what was it, 123, something like that, and create this new animation. Okay, and so I'm gonna go and replay now. So now you see these particles going up erratic. And by the way, this is the technique you can use to explore creating fireworks and lots of other types of things. And just click this again and a few times. And you might want to do other things with that too. You might want to perhaps render it over just a subset, just a range of it, right? You might say, let's go to not all the way to the end, but maybe just to frame 77. So it renders just on that a little bit, and that will add a little bit of, you know, some erratic flurries, as if like the wind is blowing over that, right? So now we have an animation that's starting to look a little bit like there's some fire action there, and we can probably add a few more, perhaps change the size of the brush, right? Let's go stop the animation here and change the size of the type of the brush. Let's say we go to I don't know, what is it, large airbrush. I think we had a medium airbrush. Let's go with large airbrush. And now before I make these changes, I may want to keep a snapshot or save copy of what I've done so far, because that was somewhat time consuming, and it's good to have a snapshot. So I'm going to go to animation, and store animation. This is really part of your workflow here. You should store that to disk. And there is a video somewhere on YouTube that where I show how you can recover it even if the program crashes, you run out of memory, your battery goes low, something like that. These are saved on disk in a temp folder, and you can recover them. But the idea is that you have a quick way to restore that as a starting point if you need to track back in time, right? So let's go and change the parameter, like the brush type, and render that again. So maybe now we have a little bit bigger elements there, and let's do that again. And in fact, let's go back to over all frames and replay that. It doesn't look like it's actually moving up anymore, so we need to probably do that again. Yeah, it looks like we are actually, see this here? It's painting just at the bottom because somehow we lost painting on particles, and that may be because I don't know, I changed something like oh, of course, yeah, when I changed the brush here, that disabled the particle brush setting. So I need to make sure I put that back in, and that's exactly why it's nice to have this. I can click here to restore that, and all this garbage I collected at the bottom is going to be lost, and I can go now and start with this again. So now I'm going to go and make sure that I'm painting all over this, and in fact I could introduce a new type of activity here. I could say let's go up and down a little bit. Up and down, up and down. Oh, but where's my force field? Looks like that one's gone. So let's go and kill this guy, and we need a force field again. Now here's the thing, we didn't store that noise image or the cold lava. So let's go do that. Let's temporarily switch to the swap image here and render that cold lava again. Right, there it is. Perhaps this time a little bit bigger. I know we can try a slightly different setting and store that. That's also something we should have stored because we know we'll get back to that. So we go and register the force field, and there we are once again with a force field in effect, and we can see it taking effect here. We can go perhaps the size is a little bit too big. Let's make it a little bit smaller. We can do that right here under this parameter, and what was it, the force, a little bit more of it. There you go, a little bit more erratic. And also the longevity, the lifespan of these particles, we might want to increase a little bit, so some of these things go up a little bit higher. Alright, so let's go switch back to the main image and see where we had drawn that thing initially, and we can just add another batch here. Let's go draw around here, something like this, undo that, and then replay, right? Over the current frame? No. Over all frames? Yes, you bet. That's the thing. So we keep adding that now, and that's another set of smoke and particles. And if you don't like it, keep changing things a little bit. And so let's do just one more. Let's go perhaps a little bit more on the lifespan here. Let's give it almost double. What else could we do? A little bit randomize my value here. Let's give it 1 and see what that does. So now we add a little bit more. You see now how some of these particles seem to be going up even higher. Alright, so that's another level of sparks and smoke and fire we can add to that. And it may not look exactly the way you like it, but there's always more you can do with that. You can blur it, for instance, right? One thing you can do, first of all, store it. Keep doing that. Store that to disk. That's a good milestone achieved. And I'm going to disable the particle. I think I'm pretty much done with the particle brushes at this time as far as painting and those fires. I'm going to now show free the force field. Don't need that anymore. I'm going to now show some other things we can do to further refine this and make it look even cooler. One thing is we'll want to blur it a little bit. So we have a saved copy here. In fact, we might even go and crop around it. We don't need all this white background here and waste so much memory for it. So one thing you could do is just see roughly what's the maximum size and contain it in a somewhat smaller area, like with the crop tool. With the crop tool, you can go and select, say, grab this corner here and give it still a good amount of margin, because you don't know how much more you might need here as you start refining things. But maybe the upper area here, the bottom here, probably we don't need a whole lot. Alright, so don't come too close. You can always finalize that cropping later on, but this is enough. Right click on that and crop to that image sequence. And so in that sense, we now have a animation that we may need to also resample or resize, because when we crop it manually like that, it's rare that you hit it exactly on even numbers or multiples of 4, multiples of 8 or something like that. So if you look under image info, you'll probably see, oh, look at that, lucky me, I didn't get any odd numbers. But most of the time it will be odd numbers. So you'll probably want to resample that anyway, make it a square or something like that. So here's another one we need to store, right? Let's go to store animation to disk. And these original ones we might not need anymore. Bad move, but not good. not a good habit, not a good practice. I always recommend keeping some and maybe even saving them. Right, you want to save them to dog waffle animation, DWA, or save them as I don't know, something like an AVI or an image sequence and so on when you're ready to start using these in other program. So at this point, let's discuss a few more ideas, a couple of things you can do with this. One thing you can do is blur it, right? So I'm going to go to the filter here, blur, Gaussian blur, and just look at a little bit of blurring on this, something like that, right? Animate this all across. So this entire thing is blurred now. Let's go and store that one. And what I'm going to do is also perhaps create an animation that's totally independent, but we will combine. So what we'll do with this one, we'll temporarily forget it, and we'll do now something where it's just like having a bunch of bubbles like these going up. And one way to do that actually is from the timeline and have it go down first and then flip the animation. Keep that in mind. Always think outside the box or outside the direction. Just because you have the snowfall filter going things down doesn't mean you could not also use it going things up, and that is by rendering it upwards or downwards first and then filtering it. So I'm going to show you erase this entire thing. We have 123 frames. Let's create an animation of 123 with just black background here, and now I'm going to go render the animation here, and by default I don't need the wind speed to go sideways. Make this one go to 0, and then let's see. All right, so what we can do is render this, and I'm going to go with large particles here. Set the size a little bit larger and have quite a bit of snowfall. And initially the velocity kind of slow, but quite a bit of turbulence also. So what we'll do is we'll render that across this entire animation, and then we'll do that again with just 1 or 2 changes in the parameters, such as, for instance, perhaps a little bit more on the velocity and a little bit more on the turbulence, and a little bit bigger on the size, or smaller so it renders faster, and apply that. And so now we have some small ones added to that, and then we can do that one more time, perhaps with again some bigger ones. And the idea is just to get a sort of a messy flow of stuff going in one direction, right? Which direction we'll ultimately keep going is for us to decide. And what we'll do is we'll actually go in the opposite direction. We'll just flip it upside down here, vertical. Right? Now, why am I doing that over the entire animation? Well, so it's so that I have a flow going this way now, right? And we will use this as a displacement map for our fire to introduce additional effects. And so what I'll do is I'll store this one as a on disk, just like the others, but we'll see that at the bottom there is an option here to use this as an animated swap. So we'll check this, and if we load this image here of the stored flames we had just earlier, we are back to this one, but we still also have this one here as an animated swap. So as we're drawing here, the swap images are coming from these frames, right? And the images we have in the main image sequence are here. We can now use the two together. We can click, for instance, here to combine them. We can combine them in different modes. Right click here and select, for instance, the exclusion mode or the difference mode, or all sorts of other modes. And with that, you'll see that you can, let's see, difference mode, and you can create all sorts of different effects here. But we're not going to combine them like this. We're going to use this image sequence as an animated force field to displace this one, and so that can create some interesting effects too. Filter, displace by swap. Pool displace is a good one because that one has a little bit of a turbulent sort of a really interesting effect here. And never mind this thing at the top here. It's gonna reflect some of these or wrap them around, we'll crop all that anyway, or we'll erase it later on. So let's animate on that, see what that looks like. And now we have something that looks even more erratic, right? And so now we could actually have done that even without this image going up here. We could have actually used our own stored image as the displacement map. Let me do that again. So let me clear this one. Let's restore that basically. And so we are back to this one. And then we actually click this one as the animated brush as well. So it's using itself as a displacement map. And it's funny because that also will create sometimes some really interesting effects. Combination of the two, for instance, might be something that you might want to explore, like lighten, darken, exclusion, difference. There's no difference here. These are the same images, so it's all going to be black, subtracting itself from the same image from itself. But you could see sometimes some interesting effects with screen mode or multiply mode or linear mode and so on, vivid light, and most importantly, we will use that as a displacement on itself. So let's go back to filter and displace by swap and see the pool displace here. How that's going to be possibly of real interest to use as a displacement map. All right, just go very easy on this, not too much of it, and then animate that to apply displacement. Sometimes the other displacement modes might be of value or of interest. Try the regular displace here and animate that. And so essentially you see a couple of different ways to perhaps create a bit more of an erratic way. You can also add ghosting trails. If you look at, in fact, let's store this one here. This one's interesting. Let's go store that to disk. And let's add some more. Let's do some ghosting trails. So if you look here under the filters in the timeline has filters similar to the filters here, but these filters are keyframeable and animatable, and there's one or two that you don't see in the regular filters, and vice versa. But here's the ghosting one, so you can do a little bit of a ghosting trails, and that will look like it's leaving a little bit more of a trail history. You can do a lot of those, or maybe just 4 or 5 frames across and apply that. And so now that one looks like it's going backwards, but it's just the nature of this algorithm. It's rendering from the end to the beginning, but in the end it's going to have it all just fine. So the first 2 or 3 frames may not be showing much of that ghosting, but now you have some of that. Now one thing you can also do is simply make this thing loopable. And sometimes you do that not so that it's loopable, but just because you may have some parts on the last half of this animation that you want to overlap with the first half. Right here, you notice most of it is down in the bottom, and if you want it to be loopable, you really need to keep some of it that's also already at the top here. So one thing you could do is simply combine the two. You might want to right-click here on this timeline and then say make loopable, and donate about half of it, right? Sacrifice half of the frames to overlap on this first half. That's basically what it's going to do. It's going to go down to a resulting 66 frames. And the last half, the second half, is going to overlap and blend over the first half. So now you have a shorter animation, but you have perhaps a bit more of activity at the bottom and the top. You also may need to occasionally expand the dynamic range again, because it gets dark at times when you multiply things and blend them. Or you might want to go all the way to filter, adjust, I don't know, curves is one of my favorite, to really make this a little bit brighter. Right, so there's a variety of tools really you use all over this, and gradually perhaps also blend it or time stretch it with frame blending, and say, well, I really want this to go back to 150 frames. So at 30 frames a second, that will be 5-second long animation. And so here we see the fire a little bit slower, not as erratic, not as fast. Let's see what else. We could perhaps smooth this again. Let's go and smooth it, blur, Gaussian blur. Or you could do a smooth that's more of a directional smooth. That's really a one to explore as well. You see the motion blur or the zoom blur, and with the zoom blur you can indicate where that zoom hotspot is that it comes from. So you put that under the fire, and then everything seems to be kind of shooting upwards. Now that may be too much, and the quality needs to be better. But you can do that, animate it, and then perhaps backtrack and combine a little bit of both. again, you have this animation, you have the prior one that hopefully you stored, and so you can store this one and put this to disk, and then you basically have the two together, and you can again combine those. So we have these two animations here, and what I'm going to do is simply use again one as the animated swap, and just combine them, for instance, right? That could be something like this here, the difference or the exclusion mode, and some of these will make some interesting combinations. Or you could use perhaps, let's see, that was the exclusion, let's use a difference mode. And again, or instead of combining them, you could do a filter and displace one by the other. So let's see, cloaking displays, jitter displays, color twirl displays. There's a couple of really interesting normal displays, a couple of really interesting modes. That one actually has perhaps more of a fire displays turbulent appearance, and animate that. And so I want you to explore some of these, because many times you'll find some rather interesting effects that you may not really have thought of or didn't know you could do, or maybe wasn't even what you're looking for your project. But then suddenly you look at it and say, oh, that's actually even cooler, or oh, I like that a lot. For instance, if you want to adjust the color here and add a little bit more, let's see, advanced level, a little bit more red on the mid-tones, or maybe add a little bit more red. That's not good, because it's going to add to everything, including the background. So we probably need to multiply here, but make it a little bit brighter and more reddish, maybe even more blue, just a little bit more of everything here. And so you can change the tint that way. There's a couple of other ways to do that. Now, sometimes you want to contain the fire here a little bit, right? So you need an alpha channel that masks it. So you could use some of these selection tools, like what is this one here, the ellipse to alpha, and create kind of a ellipsis of something like this, and then control drag it up, and then also blur it a little bit, because you don't want that really crisp cutoff here, transition. You want it a little bit blurry. So if you look at the selection and overlay alpha, you can go to blur that a little bit, like box filter alpha. That one will actually show, because the overlay you can't really see when it's already black. Multiply magenta to that, it's still pretty dark, still the same black. But in the box filter alpha, you can at least see it as a white right there, black and white, and grayscale will show you how quick that transition is happening there. So now you can basically mask it against that, right? Let's go store this mask, store alpha, and that way we have a snapshot of that if we want that. In fact, it would be nice to be able to animate that selection mask, and therefore even have some of that selection kind of dance with part of the fire. There's no reason why we couldn't do that. We can, for instance, use this image here that we had stored, this animation, and the alpha is gone, and what we'll do is we'll blur that some more. Blur, simple blur box. Let's go with the Gaussian blur, which is always fast, and then what we'll do is we'll turn this into the alpha channel. Right, so what we'll do is perhaps make it a little bit brighter, or even actually go all the way to adjust threshold, so we get it either white or black, right? And that's basically a selection mask that we want here. And so that selection mask, we need to, we can blur that a little bit more now. So we can go back to blur, Gaussian blur, and blur it something like this, animate that. So now we have sort of a selection mask that we want to combine with the other animation we already had. Okay, and I probably lost it, I didn't store it. That's okay. We have a few more we can go back to. So this one here I want to store, and I'm going to make that an animated selection. Right? The current selection I have here, we don't need it. It's this image itself, or this animated sequence, that will become the selection mask. Let me show you how. You can go to store this animation first. Right? Store that to disk. And now that it's on disk, I'm going to go say use this as an animated selection. Before that, I'm going to revert back to my prior stored flames. And so here's, let's say this is the flames I want to use, but I don't want to see all of it. I only want to see it through this one as a mask. This mask here is going to be controlling what part of these flames I'm actually seeing. Right, so that's one thing you can do there too. You could say, for instance, use as animated selection, right? And so now as I'm scrubbing through that, you can see the alpha channel, the marching ants here on the current selection, animated based on this animation. And I can use that to simply render or even combine again with what's in the swap. Let's say I'm using this one here still as the animated swap. So I have the animated swap here to do a displacement and render it with this mask applied at the same time. So I'm going to go filter, displace by swap. And if I didn't want this, by the way, if I didn't want to do any more combination, I just want to clip it through this mask, there's a filter, animation, apply mirror. It's not really going to mirror it anymore. It's just going to force the frames, render them again through the mask. So, oh, but I don't have mirror settings. I guess I'll backtrack on that one. Let's just do the displace by swap. I mean, you could always do a combine with swap and actually mix the buffers with no swap at all, right? Because you can go to show me just the swap or show me just the main image. And if you just stay on the main image and animate it nonetheless, it's going to use the alpha channel as it's animating it. That's exactly what we wanted. And so now we have a little bit of a different effect, not necessarily the one I was hoping for. But let's go and do that again. Let's go click this one in here. Let's do what perhaps really would make sense here. That's to use this one as an animated swap, this one as an animated selection. And we currently are looking at just this animation. Let's go see it through that. So let's go filter, displace by swap one more time. This time I'll use the regular displace with just a tiny little hint of it. There, animate that. And then maybe I need to actually erase the outside of that animation, right? I mean, that one existed before. It's just rendered again through it, but the outside I really would like to get rid of. So maybe what I need to do is actually, before I combine or displace again, I need to clear the animation and then pull this thing here from the swap image. So that would be a way to do it, right? If I animate, not free it, but clear the animation all to black. So now I have all this in black. The swap image I can say comes from here, or from the here. Let's use this one. And then this one here is the animated selection. So it's going to pull it from there. That's probably how I would want to do that. So let's go filter. Let's do the combine, mix the buffers, and you can see now. There you go. So now we can have it contained by the alpha, but also pulling it from the swap. All right, and so I think that should give us. There you go. So we have a variety of tools to work with to create more and more sophisticated or abstract file forms. Some of them you'll keep going. Keep doing some more blurring. Keep doing some more blurring in a directional sense. This one was a Gaussian blur. We could also do a blur in radial blur or zoom motion blur. That one is basically one where you choose the direction, maybe vertical, something like that. And so that will give it a little bit of a vertical up appearance while it's doing its animation thing here too. Alright, so hopefully that'll give you some ideas of some of the techniques you can use to explore creating your own fires. That would be perhaps something you could then attach to a candle or put in a fireplace, or use in a number of other ways. I'm gonna go disable the alpha here, clear the alpha, and then just look at the final animation that I've just created here. And it's never necessarily final, because you might say, oh, it's a little bit too dark, or I may want to increase the dynamic range to give it a bit more brightness across that. So you can see how that's probably going to be a long story still to go. And as I'm saying that, I'm finding, oh, maybe I should still do this. Let's go back to this one as the animated swap and do some more displacement of that once again. Now that it's contained in a smaller area, I might want to do that. So let's go displace by swap, maybe to pull displace once again, and just very little. You don't really need a whole lot of that, but you can certainly try and apply it more than once. And then one thing you also might want to do is, oh god, I just had an idea about something else, and 2 seconds later I'm forgetting what it was. But hey, that's how it goes at times. You want to use other types of brushes perhaps, because we had, when we initially painted these particles, we just used the airbrush as the carrier or the image, but there's a couple of others, and you could try the organic effects here with smoky, or there's a couple of others effects here, soft glow. In fact, inside the particle brushes itself, if you look at the settings here, no, rather here, the particle settings, when you enable that, you can see there's one more style we didn't actually play with. It's the Nova. Now you got to be careful not to have too many of those, but that's going to be useful too. In other words, you can basically paint more of a Nova appearance. This one's going too fast. Let's go and do that one more time with less of the lifespan. Let's give it a lifespan of just 22. There you go. Let's give it perhaps a little bit more than that. Let's give it 33, and then a little bit more randomized. A little bit. We have that force field we need to bring back in, so let's go quickly to that. Actually, use this as a force field. Why not? It could be even the animation, but let's just use this current image as a force field. Let's see if that works, if that has any value, and we should have the force field image. Oh, I guess I disabled it. Now it's back to enabled, and so I'm going to go and see if that one helps. Not that much. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually bring the original force field back in. That's this one here, and free the force field, reset it here, and calculate that force field all again. So now we can go back to the animation that we had before. Let's undo that. So here's the animation, and here's the force field, and let's see. Yeah, now we have a little bit more of a force field deflection. We probably still want to have a little bit less on the gravity. Let's go back to 1. Okay, something like that. So we have kind of a basis for yet another, using that glow effect, another way to render it. So let's do just a little bit of this here. Undo that, and then use our beloved stroke player one more time, and say apply that over the entire all frames, and replay. And so you see that also can be useful to get some flurries and more interesting looking additional details showing here, right? So you see, if you do this a few times, you'll keep adding more fire, more flurries, and bits and pieces flying around. Maybe we can increase this. Let's double it up and replay that. So you now see that this animation has further evolved and looks even more intriguing. Alright, so hopefully that'll give you some ideas of some of the fires and flames you can play with and create. And of course, in the very end, you'll want to save this, store it to an AVI or to an image sequence, and take it over to wherever it's needed after that. Alright, thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.